Hello and welcome to D Infinity Live, the show where your hosts are bludgeon curmudgeons who pivot on a gudgeon. It's a real word, look it up. I am your host, William Big T Thrasher. With me, as always, is Brendan Cass, Richard Balsley, and bringing back his jolly after an unfortunate absence, Michael Jolly Varhola. How are y'all doing, gentlemen?
Pretty good, thank you.
Good.
Excellent. And tonight, our topic is war games. War games and wargaming. From little wars to giant intergalactic conflicts. All those amazing military simulations you can play out on your tabletop. But before we get into that, we've actually got some news from around the web. Brendan, what is going on with our website, d-infinity.net?
Well, something that ties directly into wargaming is a article written by Mike. Grepolis Tips. Grepolis is an online game, free online game, war game that he wrote up some pointers on. Some defects written by you, mental defects. Rules specifically for that TV trope where someone gets knocked in the head and forgets who they are, and then gets knocked in the head again and remembers who they are. So that one's fun.
Yeah, I believe it's called a concussive amnesia.
That's exactly right, concussive amnesia. And then another cool one that's if you're a fan of Star Trek, you shouldn't miss it. It's a rules-free mission write-up that I think is very well done and clever. And then more monsters from Chris Van Deelen. It's good that he can always be counted on for those. Literally, you would never need to buy a new monster manual if you only visited D Infinity once a week and pulled together the monsters that he writes up. So good stuff as always. Well,
he's prolific. We need to give him like a nickname, Father of Beasts, or something like that.
There you go.
But it's true. I mean, if you ran a game once a week, you would hardly be able to get as many new monsters into your game as he posts at D Infinity Online in a week.
Right. And what's Eric Fabiashi is how you pronounce his name? He tries to.
He does. He creates a lot of scenarios on his Swords and Stitchery site that incorporate Chris's new monsters. So you're right. He does try to. He's a perfect example.
Yeah, he tries to use all of his monsters every week.
Yep.
Very cool. And what's going on with our co-publisher Skirmisher?
Well, sometime on the 1st, tomorrow, we will be releasing an adventure set in Kos, and that is Cat Calls, written by me. So I'm looking forward to that. It's actually the first adventure I've written.
Looking good, Richard. Hey.
Thanks.
Yeah.
First adventure that I've written, and I'm glad to say it's the first adventure to come out for Kos, and I hope that it sets a tone so people get a good idea, you know, in addition to all the stories of just what the setting's like.
Very cool. And what can players and GMs look forward to in that adventure?
A really surprising twist ending, I hope.
Excellent.
Well, I would say one thing that they can look forward to, GMs and players alike, are some really, really, really nice maps. Richard did some beautiful maps for this, which appear in the body of the adventure. But then, after he created beautiful maps that fit in the body of the adventure, I went back to him and I had him redo all the maps so that all the individual floors of the tavern could fit on 11 by 17 sheets with 1-inch squares and be printed out on 11 by 17 sheets that people could then use for their maps of the tavern with miniatures. So when you buy this adventure, you are going to get maps that you can actually use scaled with your miniatures. You can print them out on 11 by 17 paper, or scaled if you can't print out 11 by 17 or go to a copy shop. So I think that's one of the things people can really look forward to, having some really, really, really beautiful scale maps that they can move their miniatures around on.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, very much so.
And also the opportunity to role-play construction workers and women walking on the sidewalk going by them.
Now, is there a random cat call generator?
Uh, Brendan's just making noise. It has nothing to do with Brendan today. Brendan is just obstructing the process.
Indeed. Well, before we get into the main topic of the show, there is one more announcement that we're going to do. Our co-publisher Skirmisher is going to be doing a giveaway on the show. So what we have, and I'll be posting a link to this on the event page, one of Skirmisher's very first products was a war game called Skirmish, a skirmish-level fantasy wargaming rule set. They are going to be giving downloads of the PDF version of Skirmish away. All you have to do, if you want to get one of these free downloads, send your email address, go to the D-Infinity Facebook page, message us with your email address, and we will have Skirmisher message you or send you the PDF on drivethrurpg.com, and we'll actually be posting a link to that page as well. So if you want to get into some good skirmish-level miniatures action, that will be the fastest way to do it, and you have to get that in. If this is the distant future and the world is ruled by apes, and you're watching this off of some sort of meme crystal, that contest is lapsed. You have to do it during the live broadcast of this show. So we will be looking at our clocks for whenever we sign off.
And it isn't just fantasy rules. Will Skirmish is for any kind of miniatures rules. Basically, the characteristics of the miniature dictate what it can do in the game. So Skirmish is very, very basic miniatures game. And then one of the other games we published, Chevauché, is an example of medieval rules that use Skirmish rules as a platform. And we'll be talking about Chevauché a little bit more, especially if Mac, the co-author of Chevauché, happens to join us tonight, Mac McLaughlin. So Skirmish can actually be used with any miniatures for any genre.
Very, very cool. All right, well, gentlemen, I think it is time to go ahead and get into our main topic, and that is war games. Before we get into any of our specific questions and comments from our viewers, I'd just like to go around the room and we'll just, give our general impression of war games, what we like about them, how we started playing them, and I guess I'll go ahead and start. I came into wargaming very late, if only because I got into the gaming hobby during the Dark Ages, when the only real miniature game that was carried in any game stores in my area was Warhammer 40,000, and that was during the second edition, where the only way to get the rule books was to buy this $100 box set with two armies that I didn't want to play. And I was a kid. There was no way I was going to get that money. I was going to be able to scrounge that money together. So I really didn't get into the wargaming until my late teens, and I'm on again, off again. I have an on again, off again romance with wargaming, but it's a lot of fun. I really I get into the strategy of it, but more than anything else, I just love the craft of the hobby. I love painting miniatures and building terrain, so I probably spend more time working on that aspect of the hobby than actually playing myself. How about you, Richard?
Well, if discounting games like chess, I would have to say that my first introduction would have been Squad Leader, and depending on what time frame you want to look at, I've been dabbling with it for a good 20 some odd years now.
Very cool. And Brendan?
Well, so I guess I wargamed before I really understood the concept, as a term. Back in the day, I would come up with rules to sort of mediate playing with my friends, because my friends, as all children tend to be, were dicks and they cheated. So we had to come up with rules to fairly determine which one of our Lego figurines won. I happened to use rubber bands just off the tip of fingers, right? Which worked pretty well. Which I thought, it was kind of funny that, however long later, I don't know, whenever I started with Skirmisher and we started doing the little Orc Wars thing, it was funny that we started doing the catapults with rubber bands to resolve our combat, because, that was something that I did when I was little, right? So I thought that was cool. And then, of course, Little Orc Wars is better than I'd come up with, in part because I took what I did when I was young and then rewrote it as I was older because I wrote part of the rules, right? So that was my introduction.
Very cool. And Mike, we have purposefully given you the last spot in this introduction because as an old grizzled veteran and an old grizzled veteran wargamer, we know you're going to have some pretty big opinions about this.
A grown yard. Well, I guess it depends what you mean by a war game. I was a very industrious young boy, and I used to go around the apartment building where I lived carrying out people's trash for a nickel or a dime or a quarter a bag, and I would use that money to buy Airfix plastic miniatures. So I started collecting an army of Airfix and Matchbox and Atlantic plastic miniatures that eventually grew to be almost 10,000 soldiers. And I was buying those myself from about the age of 7 onward and staging big battles with them. I didn't have any kind of formal rules, but of course, there were canons in your mind as to what the soldiers could or could not do. So I would say that was the first informal step into wargaming. My mother, I remember, bought me one day when I was sick and was 9 years old. She bought me a Risk set. So I started playing Risk from about the age of 9 onward, and I'd say that's a war game light. It's pretty hardcore war game for a 9-year-old. But moving up, you get into more and more complex stuff, and eventually I moved into a game Richard mentioned, Squad Leader, and I played Squad Leader probably for about 20 years off and on, for about the age of 15 to about the age of 35, and it is a pretty awesome game. It's an Avalon Hill World War II tactical level, squad level war game. And, there are a lot of games that I've enjoyed as much. There might be games that are as good. I don't think there are any games that are better than Squad Leader. I would never play it again. It's too complicated, and I've moved on to other things. So I'd never play it again. I've moved on to other things, and now at this point in my life, I'm interested in war games that are simpler rather than more complex. So I'm with Brendan. I love Our Little Orc Wars because it's a simple war game. Because it's a game that you could explain to a 13-year-old and they're going to completely get it and have fun with it. But it's a game that an adult can really get into and apply a lot of tactics to. And as much as anything, I've reached the point in my life where, because I love role-playing games, I'm interested in that place where role-playing games and war games intersect.
Yeah,
and just real quick, going back 40 years, when we used to play Risk early on, we got to the point very early on, before I ever knew what a role-playing game was, before I ever played D&D, where we'd pull one of my Airfix miniatures and use it as my commander somewhere on the board and make up some rudimentary rule as to what that meant. You got to roll an extra die or add +1 to a die, or you lost automatically if that territory got captured. And that is vestigial role-playing. That's essentially the process that Gary Gygax followed with chainmail, which led him into role-playing. So that crossover from the war game to the person who's inclined to play role-playing games is natural, and I think a lot of us end up following the same path parallel to each other.
Yeah, a lot of people do forget that Gygax and Arneson, D&D, what they created was born out of trying to give more personality to their old game Chainmail.
Right.
Yeah, and actually that goes back to the first war game I was ever heavily into was first edition Warzone, which I think at the time was published by like Pressman Industries or Paradox Target Games. Target Games published that in the early '90s, and it was a pretty well put together war game designed kind of to compete, to be the competitor to Games Workshop and their Warhammer line. But one of the things that struck me about it is that it was based on the tabletop role-playing game Mutant Chronicles. And there was a whole appendix in the back of the book where it had rules for taking the units from Warzone and converting them so you could use them as monsters or NPCs in Mutant Chronicles. But then there were also rules for taking your party from Mutant Chronicles and converting them into special soldiers for use in your army in Warzone, and I really love that overlap.
That is clever because inevitably a lot of times in an RPG, if you're not doing dungeon crawls and your players get involved with politics, a lot of times it ends up with some kind of war, right, or a battle. And then, systems like D20, for example, don't really handle that very well. You end up making, roles that kill large swaths of people, but then their characters end up dying too. So it's not real clean. So it's nice, and it's actually something that when I do game development for role-playing, I'm working on a new role-playing game right now, is if I wanted to scale this up to mass combat, not just tactical small scale combat, would it still work? And it's good when other people do the same thing.
Yeah, although it can be a mixed bag, because a lot of role-playing games now do have mass combat rules, and sometimes the mass combat rules work really, really well. Two prime examples that spring to my mind are Savage Worlds and Pathfinder. Now both have very good, very refined mass combat rules, which you could play as a war game on its own.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have a lot of games, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s, where there were mass combat rules that were clearly written by role-playing game developers that didn't have much experience with war games. The prime example being Vampire: The Dark Ages had some of the worst mass combat rules I've ever seen. As much as I love Vampire: The Dark Ages, if you wanted to have your game take place during the Crusades and you wanted to have your vampire lead a force in that Crusades, your game would come to a crashing halt the moment those mass combat rules came out.
Well, I think going back, to the 80s, having the mass combat rule that integrates perfectly with the role-playing game, that's kind of the holy grail in a lot of ways. And I don't know, you mentioned that there are a lot of role-playing games that have got that now. Personally, I don't know which ones have done it satisfactorily. D&D never really did that I saw. They had their battle system, and I don't think that was entirely satisfactory. I think at this point, I would not want my character that I had brought up to a certain level subject to the vicissitudes of a role that affected things on a strategic or tactical level.
No, they die.
I think if I were going to do an integration, and we do so many rules in games, probably we will do this one day, but if I were going to do an integration between a war game, a tactical or strategical level war game, and a role-playing game, what I would do is have the results of what happens on the war game somehow affect what happens in the role-playing game. So if one side wins, then we go down into tactical time with the characters, and because their side lost to an army of orcs, well, now they're dealing with twice as many orcs, and they've got to exfiltrate from a battlefield where they're dealing with orcs, and where there's a big chance they could get killed, but in the context of a role-playing game, not a random roll where they get wiped out in the context of a battle. And vice versa. If you wanted to do it so that the characters did something really, really successful in a role-playing context, then allow that to have a +1 on some sort of a tactical or strategic role. But I think having one thing do both, I don't like that anymore. I think having one affect the other is the way I would do it now.
Yeah, I've played around with that. There was a fantasy campaign I ran not too long ago where that actually was a part of the game. If you won a battle, your whole party got some sort of benefit from that. If you lost a battle, all your antagonists got a benefit of that. You know, one prime example being, it was a science fiction campaign. They had liberated this space colony that was, that was like this. They liberated a mining colony, and so the advantage they got, they never had to refuel their ship ever again, because this colony was now supplying them with the radioactive material their ship needed to fly. They were so thankful, and it's cool to do that kind of thing.
It's interesting that you guys bring up D&D, especially with something like battle system. I think the problem with that is that they try to put in too many tactical rules. Because if you go back to the old system for basic D&D, especially what you find in Rule Cyclopedia, it's a really simplistic system, and it's elegant enough that it works on its own. And it has more that feel that the players don't have to be affected by the outcome directly, but it's like if these units fought each other, you make this like once you figure out the battle rating for everything, then you just make a couple of rolls to determine the outcome, and it tells you how many percentage of troops are lost on each side. Right. Or if one side is routed over the other, right? It's that kind of stuff. And had a few things for, were they in a forced march, so that shows how much ground they could cover, but that also affected like their quality if they like encountered anybody, before resting and all that stuff. So I mean, it was it's a few pages of the rule cyclopedia, but that's it. That's all you need. And it has rules for using your characters to augment the forces by contributing their levels and spells and crap to the overall rating, but the results don't show that you would necessarily be wiped out if you participated as part of that unit. So you do the roll, represent, tell how much stuff happens, during that time, and then turn around and then let the players go back to playing their roles, after they got the outcome of the battle.
We got our first comment or question comes from Richard Penwarden. Wants to know, when you make your army, how much of your decision is based on numbers and how much on what you feel is right? And I guess for me, when I'm building an army for a wargame I'm playing, usually the last thing I care about are the army's numbers, so long as I get as close to that point cost limit as possible, assuming it's a war game with like a point buy system for building your army. Simply because I loved themed armies. I love having units that I think are cool, either because the miniature looks cool or it has some cool ability or whatnot. Now, keeping in mind, I lose more than half the time, so obviously I'm not making strategic decisions when I'm making my army. But I want to bring an army that looks and feels impressive to the battlefield, even if it isn't as strategically effective as someone else's min-maxed army.
I'm kind of the same way. In a sense, role-playing games have ruined me for a lot of other games, because I get to the point where I don't even care as much whether I win or lose. I care whether a good story is being told. So this does not set me up really well for victory in a lot of war games. I will say that I'm enough of a professional war gamer that if the game encourages munchkining, my armies or my actions, and that's how everybody else is acting, then I'm going to do it too. But I would say when I'm writing rules, I encourage rules that don't facilitate that. So when we wrote the skirmish rules, we said basically, what's the way you create your armies? Reach into your bucket of soldiers or whatever and grab one handful or two handfuls or however many handfuls. Everybody gets the same number of handfuls of troops. Well, some people are going to end up with better armies than others, and that's just too bad. That's just the way it goes. Better luck next time. So that's my recommendation for creating armies for Little Orc Wars or for skirmish. Reach into your bucket or container of soldiers, grab a couple of handfuls, however many handfuls, and let the pieces fall where they may.
Brendan?
Well, so the numbers definitely factor into it, but a lot of times I use those to motivate decision. A lot of times I'll pick my units based on a play style that I want to try. I'll think of some sort of literary example of how, maybe the Mongols used to do all this stuff by horseback or whatever, or
Right.
simple example, the Romans with their shield walls or whatever. So I'll end up picking units because I want to emulate a style of play. Now, more often than not, I end up losing too. But that's because I want to see the battle unfold that way. And I'll try to maximize my armies based on that style of play within the restraints of whatever point buy system that I'm working in. Usually doesn't end up optimized, but is cool. Sometimes I'm lucky enough that the game system I'm playing in models real life well enough that if I try to emulate a successful strategy that somebody used in history, it'll actually work in the game system. And I'm always impressed when that happens.
Very cool. How about you, Richard?
Well, I don't play as many point buy systems for war games. Most of the stuff I do, like I said, like games like Advanced Squad Leader. And while it does have a point system for DIY scenarios, most of the ones that, I have like, 50 scenarios from all the stuff that I bought that I haven't really built anything. But on the rare instance that I have had to build a military force, I'm very tactical when it comes down to it. And it goes back to my training with the military, and it depends really what I want to do. Do I want to go weapons heavy, armor heavy, or am I trying to do light and fast? And so that really pretty much determines my style, because unfortunately, if you try to do everything, and I think this is something that most people don't understand about warfare in general, let alone war games, if you try doing everything at once, you're pretty much setting yourself up for failure. You're not going to succeed. You cannot have a balanced force of of speed, weapons, and armor. It doesn't exist. And if you try doing it, you're going to get run over.
That's a good strategic advice. Next comment comes from David Little, who wants to know if we're going to talk about the Star Wars miniature battles games. Actually, I wouldn't mind. Back when I was just a little gamer, growing up in the wilds of Norfolk, Virginia, that was a game I always wanted to try, but never got a chance to. Our local game shop had one pristine, still in the shrink wrap copy of Star Wars Miniatures Battles, and I looked at that thing for years, but I never bought it because they never carried any of the miniatures, and I was just like, if I'm going to play the Star Wars game, I want to use the Star Wars miniatures, and it was just that was what was going on in my head that unfortunately prevented me from getting into what I've been told by all accounts is a very good game. Do any of you have experience with Star Wars Miniature Battles?
I don't. I've never played that.
I had a Star Wars battleship game, which had little miniature Star Wars ships. But no, unfortunately not. Still like to try it, but I haven't seen it.
I would definitely try it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in conventions. None of it. So, shoot.
I think there's a lot, and we've talked about the Star Wars universe any number of times on this show. I think there's a lot that's implied that you don't see in the movies that really would adapt well to a miniatures game or a tactical level thing. So I think that that would be a lot of fun.
I will say
who would I want to be? The guys with the blasters that don't have any aiming mechanisms but are well armored, or the people who always hit but wear no armor? I don't know. That's a tough one. But yeah, I think that would be a great thing to adapt to miniatures. Would love to give that a try. Absolutely.
I will say this about Star Wars wargaming. There are any number of Star Wars video games. The best one that comes to mind is Empire at War, which is a Star Wars real-time strategy game. So the video game adaptation of war games. So what war games eventually evolved into on the computer. That did a very good job. I really enjoyed it. Did a good job of balancing, one against the other. Mostly it came down to Imperials having better stuff, but you can overwhelm them with your rebels. So a typical kind of balancing act there. And then you throw in Jedi, sort of mess stuff up. But it was a good game. And yeah, I mean that universe does work. You do see bits in the movies where you've got a lot of spaceships zipping around, shooting at each other, and I've always been a big fan of vehicle-based war games. So things that use, for example, sailing ships, men at war, and all of that. I've always been a huge fan of those. I like boats, so that's probably why.
We've talked. It seems like every time we mention Star Wars, we also end up talking about Dune, and it just occurs to me, it shocked me that there's no Dune war game.
Well, actually, there are a couple of board games where.
Well, I've seen a lot of like sort of territorial control based board games. I've never seen a game where you get to take a squad of Sardaukar and throw them up against a squad of Fremen.
Well, the only one that actually is like that are the Westwood Studios games that were done of the Dune franchise, and like Dune 2, Dune 2000, Dune Emperor. That's the only real thing you have. It goes like back to what Brendan was saying about like real-time strategy games. It's that model of game. In fact, Dune was one of the first to do that, and it's essentially the war game without the turn-based strategy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we've got another question from Richard Penwarden. Are there any rules in war games or rules areas in war games that no one has gotten right? And I will say right off the bat, and I've only seen this handled well once, and that's morale rules. I absolutely
hate morale rules.
Yeah, I hate morale rules. Yeah. There is nothing less fun than having your soldier shot at. A bullet bounces off their armor, not harming them, but the rules say your guy has to randomly run away.
Right.
I hate that because, like, one, I don't want to see cowardice in my post-apocalyptic war game. This is supposed to be about, the background for the game says these people have been lobotomized to have the fear center of their brain removed. Why are they running away? But also, like, it's taking control away from the players. And I really don't like that. It almost immediately trashes any strategy you can have, because even when your guys are surviving, they'll still run away. I cannot stand that.
I would say that in the context of a war game, the first thing that came to mind when you said, what is the thing that isn't handled right? What is the thing that you don't like? I would say morale, just like you did, because it does exactly what you said. It takes a lot of the control away from you in the context of a war game. But going to the other extreme with morale, I would say that it doesn't get used enough or properly in the context of role-playing games. And I don't mean for purposes of forcing the characters to retreat if something happens to them. But how many times have you been in a fight where the white-tailed deer fight to the death? You're down to the last white-tailed deer or elephant or goblin or whatever it is. The last one is still fighting you to the death. And then finally the party just surrounds it and all 6 of them chop it up, whatever the hell it is. Well, obviously, in real life, the innocuous thing that happened to attack you or the violent humanoid that you ambushed or whatever is going to run off long before there's only one left. So I think morale doesn't tend to get handled properly. I think it tends to be too heavy-handed in the context of war games and really not handled at all, not implemented at all in the context of role-playing games a lot of the time.
I actually found a good example of morale in war games, and that would be Advanced Squad Leader. I mean, I know I go back to that one a lot, but it's one of the few games that got a lot of stuff right. I mean, there's a few issues that you could quibble over, and it's mostly in the fact that there are so many counters that you have to keep track of, which is the hardest part of the game. Because, like,
hundreds of them.
Yeah, there's just so many. It's like, okay, are they in the ravine? Are they on the crest of the ravine? Are they standing just outside of the ravine? There's all sorts of stuff like that. But when it comes to the morale, the quality of your troops actually determines the morale rating as well as the nationality. And
That's right.
And one of the interesting things with that is that the units that don't break often are the ones that are the hardest to get back when they break.
That's
And
right.
so that's one of the things I think that they did right
Mhm.
in that regards, because like, okay, the American forces, they're the ones that have the worst morale, but
That's
they're
it.
also the ones that that recover the quickest when they
That's
break.
right.
And rather than going off in a random direction, the rules say you have to move them away from the firefight, away from the enemy. That's all it
Right.
says. If they're too close to the enemy, they get captured and eliminated from
Right.
the battle. Otherwise, you just keep moving them away till they get to a certain distance, and then you can stop and just roll and pray that you hit that morale check and get them
That's right.
back.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. Advanced Squad Leader did as good a job with that as anything I've ever seen.
I don't know. Are there any other rules out there that any of you think very few games have done well?
I'm going to say multiple levels, because this is actually one where ASL has trouble, and that with the red barricade scenario, there's a lot of tunnels that between the factory buildings that
Mhm.
only the snipers can use, right? So
Mhm.
they can move through these tunnels, but there's nothing on the map, so it's all simulated movement, so there's no way to really track where they go, or any way to cut them off if you have troops between the two buildings that are able to disrupt the movement by shelling the ground.
I'd say one thing that war games in general often have trouble doing, and Richard already alluded to the fact that Advanced Squad Leader got around this to some extent, so I'm not talking about it, but really kind of getting a national character in with various armies, or whatever the historic character of those armies would have been, reflecting that in the rules so that the players are not encouraged to do something different than what would have otherwise been done. I mean, you'll get old hardcore gamers, I mean, like the guys who play like Napoleonic stuff, and they're going to play their armies the way those armies historically would have been played. I mean, this is a hardcore gamer. But I think a good rule set encourages you to play an army the way it would have historically been played. And by extension, a really good fantasy or science fiction set is going to have rules that sort of model the same sort of thing. So having rules that really reflect national or ethnic or species or whatever characteristics in your armies, I think that's something you don't see done well enough, often enough, which encourages play that is discordant with what you would have seen with those armies in actuality.
Yeah, you know what? One of the things I think that causes that is I think the writers of the rules expect you to learn through trial and error what the weapons and armor of the units, is supposed to hint at what they were supposed to be doing. And I think that's one of the things that's not covered, and it doesn't really get explained as to how that would work in practice. It only gives you the statistics for them.
Well,
yeah, exactly.
I've got to take a more, I guess, meta tact to my answer about this. The rules that war games, I think, tend to get wrong, and wrong's not really the right word, but don't really do well enough.
Right.
And this counts for tabletop war games and also the video game versions of a lot of war games. Granted, there are some good examples of both that I think don't fall into this pit, but the rules themselves in a lot of cases are not necessarily presented in a user-friendly way. These are very smart people writing these games. Smart, passionate people who care a lot about war gaming and all that stuff. But it typically is a war game written, in a lot of cases, for themselves. Or for other war gamers who are of a like mind, so maybe their gaming group, right? So they tend to be dense, difficult to pick up. Nowadays, because people's attention spans are so short, I find a lot of new war games have like a quick play rules, and then you can move into more advanced rules, which I think is clever. But here's the thing: I can't get my dad to sit down and play a new war game with me, because I know that our first session is going to be me reading the rules to him and him asking me questions 10 minutes in about that rule I just read to him.
Right.
So, you know, a lot of clever visuals are handy if you can hand out cards. Actually, at Comic Palooza, Clint did a very good job with that. He had cards for his Chevauché scenario, which I thought was just fantastic. So things like that, you know, and that takes extra work. It takes working with graphic designers. It takes working with like people who have a mind for user experience design. But it's something that I'm sensitive to because of my work in the computer industry and software development. You got to make sure that people can take it up and start it up regardless of their exposure.
We've got another question. This is going to be a really fun one from friend of the show, Heath, in Australia, who wants to know, what are the host's favorite war games? For me, it is neck and neck right now between War Machine and Malifaux. I find them to both be pretty easy, pretty quick playing, but in general I like them for different reasons. I like War Machine because I think it has a lot of really nice tactical options, and also it's not expensive to get into. You can spend $30-$35 to get like a battle box, and that's got a whole force you can use.
What game is that?
War Machine.
War Machine, okay.
Privateer Press. And then Malifaux by Weird Miniatures. I like that for two reasons. One, because of the atmosphere. It's a very atmospheric game that is just meant to be generally creepy. You know, for instance, in any game, you actually pick secret goals for your army, and you can actually you can have all your people killed, but still win the game if you manage to accomplish whatever those secret goals were. And it leads to a lot of guessing, because when anything dies in Malifaux, it leaves a corpse behind, and so you do have to wonder, okay, I've just killed a guy, but does his secret goal involve gathering corpses? Did I just technically give him a point? So it leads to a lot of, it's almost like poker brought in as a war game. The other thing I like about it, I think it does morale rules well. The morale rules only come into the game if you specifically try to demoralize your opponent's forces. So you can't just assume your opponents are going to get terrified, demoralized, depressed, or whatnot. You have to take specific strategic actions on your turn to make that happen, and I really enjoy that. Now, how about the rest of you? What are your favorite war games?
I'd say my favorite two war games today, right this minute, are Grappleless, because that's what I've been playing. It's a resource management game on the one hand, but then you can gather more resources by attacking other cities, and you've always got, well, you know, for want of a better phrase, trolls who are lurking about getting ready to attack your city. I have to say that I only ever attack in that game ghost cities, cities that have been started by players who then stop playing. There are people who will actively attack cities that are run by people who are still playing. So I try to bring my ethics even into the game. So Grappleless is one of my favorites right now because it's what I happen to be playing. But then Little Orc Wars, that is just such a fun and intuitive game. It's so intuitive. Brendan was talking about his dad's resistance to learning new rules, which is a fairly common thing. But the first time his dad ever played Little Orc Wars, he came over to my house, and we played for 16 hours straight. It's an intuitive game. So it's a game that you can make as simple or as complex as you want to be. Nothing looks better. I've never seen a game that looked better at a convention. We ran it this past year, what, Brendan? Over 1,200 square feet?
Yes.
It's like a 60 or 50 by 25 game or something ridiculous like that. Hundreds of miniatures and rivers and lakes that you built, Will, a whole sea coast and dozens of catapults. I mean, it's such a great-looking game. It's so fun. As many people as want to play it can play it, and it's something that we're just going to keep supporting and developing moving ahead. So I would say that for sure is my favorite game. It's one of my favorite games at the moment, in part because I helped develop it, and I think we've just brought such a great thing to the concept of tabletop and floor gaming with Little Orc Wars.
Very cool. All right, another really good question from Heath. He wants to know if we've had an experience with homemade war games, and I would say, apps. I am sure we all have. I myself have been tinkering with my own war game for the past 2 years, and that's just the one I'm tinkering on now. In college, I was kind of tinkering with my own homemade war game. In high school, I was tinkering with my own homemade war game. I think it's just something that as a gamer you have to do. And
Yeah.
I have friends both who are just gaming hobbyists and some who are professional game designers who are working on their own homemade war games, and I've played their games. One really good source of homemade war games I do want to recommend, the website ironhands.com. It's a gaming hobby website. The guy who runs it does a lot of really intricate terrain work in games modeling. But he has children now, and he wants his children to be involved in the hobby, so he invents war games that use whatever action figures his kids are playing with that year. And there's now a huge collection. He's got everything from his own little Star Wars adventure game to a monster hunting game, a pirate ship game, and they're really simple, they're really straightforward, and they're really fun. And there's information for both the rules on the website and also rules for how to model some of the custom game pieces. His pirate ships with the skull faces, the pirate spaceships are amazing. I would definitely check out his tutorial on how to make your own.
Well, I want Brendan and Richard to both be able to chime in on homemade war games, but I'd like to address that because it's especially pertinent to the subject of Skirmisher Publishing. I think there's a fine. What is a homemade war game? Where does a homemade war game and a corporately produced war game? What is the dividing line between them?
Does it have heart, Mike?
Well, no. What I'm saying is this. Bear with me. Skirmisher Publishing takes its name from the game Skirmish, which is the first game we ever published, which we published before Skirmisher was a company. Skirmisher Online Game Magazine published the Skirmish Wargaming rules, and the Skirmish Wargame rules go back to the Skirmish rules we created back in 1980 to 1982. And they were based on articles I read in Wargamers Digest magazine from about 1977 to 1978 onward. So we now publish a game called Skirmish, which is a miniatures game published by a game company. But it started off as something that I was developing from about 1978 onward. So I would venture to say that most good war games are homemade war games on some level because there's something that somebody started off playing with or trying at home, and they eventually got published by some kind of company or taken to the next level by a company. But as far as Skirmisher goes, there's we can't find the line between homemade and professionally published because most of our games are homemade to some level on some extent.
That's true. A good example of that, a buddy of mine in my gaming group happens to have developed a tactical war game, so a squad-based war game, just at home, and he mentioned it to me one day, and I'm like, well, let me take a look at it. And you know, if you're willing to follow through on writing the rules for it, you know, you can get it published if you're interested in doing that. Well, that's just something that he did at home and in his free time. And I mean, I mentioned the rules that I came up with when I was little. There's some of that, but yeah. A lot of stuff ends up happening at home, you know, even if it's just house rules for something that other people have published. A lot of times, if you come up with something completely separate from the games that you play from established publishers, you can figure out the kinks that you don't like necessarily in other systems, and then you can adapt those published systems which might have better support, you know, with scenarios or miniatures or other things like that. And, you know, after you've modified the rules, maybe you like the game a little bit more. So I think, you know, coming up with your own ideas is important with anything you do, not just wargaming, but is helpful it's definitely helpful with wargaming.
Well, the best war gamers, just like I've always said, the best role-playing gamers, the best war gamers, the best gamers are game developers. They're the ones who they play something and they say, oh, how can I do an add-on to this? How can I improve this? How can I make this better? How can I fix this in my game?
All right, and our last question from the evening is going to come from Tom Payne, who wants to know, what about role-playing games where the characters can wind up in a war zone and enter a mass fight? And we did talk about this earlier, but not in too much detail. I would say when that happens, you got to look at whether the role-playing system you're using has mass combat rules and whether those mass combat rules are any good. I am a huge advocate that if the game you're playing has rules that don't work, just ignore them or rip them out. So you got to figure out how you want to handle that mass combat. You know, if I just want to get the outcome of that fight over with quickly and I don't want to narrate a mass battle, I will just have it come down to one roll. I'll have one person make a strategy roll if the game has such a skill, modified by whatever warfare assets other players might be able to bring to the conflict. And then that's great. It's over with in one roll. I can cut straight to the aftermath. If you want that fight to be big and dramatic and you want your players to have very minute control over the way that battle's gonna unfold, make sure you've got a good mass combat system, or improvise a mass combat system. And this actually goes back to Vampire the Dark Ages. Didn't want to get involved with their mass combat system, so I just dealt out cards for just a standard playing card deck. The players got a number of cards equal to their characters' strategy skills, and then I gave myself a number of cards equal to the strategy skill of the warlord they were going up against. And what we did is we just divided the table into different sort of theaters of battle, and they would play cards on those segments face down to divide up their forces, and then we turned the cards face up, and whoever had the highest total value of cards in that area would win. And so that allowed us to do things like bluff. If I've put one card in this territory, well, is that one super powerful card that you're going to not be able to overcome? Or is that a useless territory and I just put a pointless scout in there to draw away your forces? And that was a pretty good alternative to the mass combat system we were presented with. Richard, how about you?
Well, I've encountered a couple of items here where you have to look at how big of a group are you going against, right? Because that can make all the difference, especially if you're playing in a sci-fi or modern game and people have automatic weapons or even semi-automatic weapons. You might be able to target multiple opponents in a single attack. So that kind of cuts down on the numbers of things you have to keep track of, right? And then you have Bessem 3rd edition had a clobbering mooks rule, where if you have a bunch of flunkies who are clearly just there to get in your way, so the villain can get away and live to fight another day kind of scenario, then you just treat them as if they all have 1 hit point each, right? And if your characters are really, really powerful in comparison, then every point of damage that they do, say firing their gun, kills a mook. So you get rid of them quickly, and it shows how awesome the characters are. So the story stays focused on how good the characters are in terms of their prowess in various areas. Otherwise, you get into that murky situation. Is do we go to larger scale rules, or do we just try to grind it out? And that's no fun. So generally, that's what I look for first. If neither of those are in place, then I kind of default to something like what you were saying, Will, where I'll just come up with something that's a little less complex, but gives the same cinematic feel or dramatic feel, depending on the game. So that way, the players don't feel they're getting cheated out of the story.
How about you, Brendan?
Well, so it depends a lot with the tone of your on the tone of your game. I know in a previous show we covered low fantasy and its difference when compared to high fantasy.
Right.
If you're playing a high fantasy game, then your characters are and should be well and above, you know, your average soldier. In a situation like that, what I typically will do is eschew any, you know, mass combat rules in favor of basically, you know, giving you a bird's eye view of what the combat looks like, but your characters are whatever level they are. They have whatever hit points they have, and then similar to what Richard was saying, you know, with your 1 hit point units, have entire squads be considered a single monster, right? So, you know, there are swarm rules in a lot of game systems or whatever, but, you know, if you're trying to simulate combat in a high fantasy scenario, your hero is cutting through swaths of enemies. So give the unit a single block of hit points. Give the unit a single block of a single armor class, you know, hit dice and base attack bonus for whatever, to use, you know, D20 terms. And then when
I've never done that before. That's a good idea.
yeah, when your heroes kill the monster, they've actually killed the unit, and that way the unit can. Maybe the unit has multiple attacks, right? Because there's a bunch of people in it. But you can only put so many of your units into action depending on, you know, what they're using. If they have spears, then maybe only the 10 front linemen can attack your hero. So it gets 10 attacks maybe. So then both sides would have these monsters that could attack each other and so on. That's typically how I like to handle large-scale combat, because it still uses the small-scale tactical rules that the game does well.
Right.
So give your squads feats, give them spells if you like, and do it that way. Yeah, that's how I would recommend it for a high fantasy kind of battle if you want to do large scale. For low fantasy, shouldn't be doing large scale battles anyway. You don't understand your genre, so don't do that.
Right.
All right, Mike, do you have any final thoughts on this particular subject?
On integrating characters into battles? Is that the question?
Into mass battles, yes.
Just alluding back to what I said before. I wouldn't have the fate of the characters be determined by the same role that determined how the battle turned out. To me, it wouldn't really matter. If the side the characters were part of won, then I would give the characters some sort of modifiers or benefits, and I would actually play out a scenario, an inset scenario that reflected what actually happened to them. Because even for the side that wins, somebody's going to get killed if they screw up or they're unlucky. And then if the character side lost, well, so what? Then just the nature of the encounter changes. Then the characters are dealing with 2 or 3 times as many of something in particular, or maybe some elite unit that they came across, or maybe having to escape the battlefield to exfiltrate it. So I would have, the way I would handle it is I would probably a way to handle it would be to resolve the overall battle and then to tweak a battlefield role-playing game scenario based on the results of that bigger battle and have those results affect what the players have to deal with in their scenario. I'd make a scenario based on the results of the battle.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen,
they've got to chase down an enemy commander. If they're losing, they've got to escape, for example.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that has been our show on war games. All that is left for us now is our final thoughts. But before we jump into that, because we are still live, unless you're watching this in a future ruled by our ape overlords, there is still time to get a free copy of the skirmish rules on PDF. Just go to the D Infinity Facebook page and message us their email address. But for our actual final thoughts, my final thought is that the thing that I love the most about wargaming is not the game itself, but that the wargaming hobby is so much bigger than the game. And as I said, one of my favorite things is painting and modeling. You can see right here, I actually brought a terrain piece I'm working on right now. It's a Temple of Menoth for War Machine, which I will be giving to my local game store, Moonlight Comics, when it's complete. The real hard part was actually carving out the Menoth holy symbol, which will be painted to resemble metal and put on the bell tower.
Beautiful.
But it's cool. It's got plenty of spaces for the miniatures. It's all
That's
sized so you can actually fit the miniatures on all these different
Right.
crevices.
Nice
You won't have to worry
battle
about whether your
platform.
big
You
units
want.
can fit there.
Mhm.
And I love it. I love that it's a hobby that lets me build things, and that's one of my favorite things to do.
Nice.
Richard, your final thoughts.
Well, in terms of war games, I would just like to say, like, just look at what you're looking at playing, because most games are actually war games, even if you don't realize it. Iron ships and wooden ships and iron men, chess, backgammon. Anytime you have a situation where it's a winner take all, chances are it's a war game, and you just didn't realize it.
Cool. And Brendan, final thoughts.
Well, if you're a war gamer or even a role player, I guess it doesn't really matter, but it's particularly useful for war gamers. You can go to d-infinity.net/miniatures for any number of articles written up by the D-Infinity crew on how to make your own miniatures or make your own wargaming props and models, and lots of clever tips there, because we're just as frugal as you are, and don't want to necessarily spend all of our hard-earned money on miniatures, but that doesn't necessarily mean we want to play a shabby-looking game either. So a lot of really good tips there, d-infinity.net/miniatures that you can see there to incorporate into your game. And I'm sure Will is going to post an article about how he made that wonderful-looking temple, in case you're interested.
I'm just shocked he hasn't already.
Indeed, I will. I will have that. I will also have how I built a crypt, and also how I built tombstone barricades for a horror-themed board I've been working on.
Your stuff does look good. You should be telling our watchers how to make that stuff and show them how you inspire them for their own things. Absolutely.
Yep.
And Mike, we'll go ahead and give you the final thought.
Final thought is check out Richard's cat calls. His final thought, he is so self-effacing, he didn't want to mention cat calls. It is a great D20 adventure. It is about what happens when you overstay your evening in a tavern, and just how south it can go. So I recommend checking out Cat Calls. We're releasing that sometime early on August 1, which is to say sometime after midnight. As soon as possible after midnight, we're going to be releasing Cat Calls. It's going to be available on drivethrurpg.com, RPG Now, Paizo.com, so people should check that out. And then keep an eye on my growing list of Brepolis tips. If you're interested in playing Brepolis or Forge of Empires or any of the games of that ilk, I've got some good tips that, unless you're a much better gamer than me, will be of some use to you. And take a look at them. If none of them have any use, then you'll know you're a better gamer than me.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, that has been D-Infinity Live for this week on the topic of war games. So for myself, William Big T Thrasher, for Michael Jolly Varhola, for Richard T. Balsley, and for Brendan Cass, we are D-Infinity Live, and we will see you all for another live broadcast next week.